I would like to welcome you on behalf of Katie Shevin, Director at GBI, Enrique Luz, Technical Advisor at CEBDS, and myself. We have been driving this. We have been organizing this, and we'll take you through the day. And we have invited a few speakers of the day to help us dive deeper into the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and to get some insights from business as well. We will start with opening remarks from Andrea Álvares from Natura. We will then go quickly into the workshop series overview and use Mentimeter to introduce ourselves. We will then get into the heavy part of the webinar on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and really highlight what you need to know and really help you understand what they are about. And then at the end, we will share with you some practical resources that you can then use in your own work going forward. Today's speakers, we're very excited to have three very knowledgeable speakers today. Andrea Álvares, Chief Brand Innovation, International and Sustainability Officer at Natura. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us. Simone Roche Pinto, Advisor for Latin America at GBI, and Gerald Pachoud, also Advisor at GBI, and we will hear a bit more about them from Katie later. But I would like to hand over to Enrique now to introduce Andrea and her opening remarks. Enrique, over to you.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. Just as David speak, we have this webinar in English, but you can also ask questions in Portuguese, and me and Simone can try to translate to English to facilitate this the participants. And also, I'd like to present Andrea Álvares, Chief Brand Innovation International and Sustainability Officer of Natura, that she will give us some inspirational words about the importance of business to give great effort on respecting human rights. Please, Andrea.
Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, David. Really, I'd like to start by thanking the World.
Sorry, Andrea. Andrea, we can't hear you. We just lost your audio. It worked for a second and then it was gone. Wait a second. We lost you there. Just to double check, Enrique, if you can try to speak just to see that the audio is good on your side, and maybe. Yeah.
Are you listening?
Works. Yeah, we can hear. We just lost Andrea's audio. It was good for 2 seconds. No. Still not. Yes, you can try. Okay, Andrea will try to log off quickly and come back, and then maybe the audio will come back with her. We still can't hear her. Let me just see. Let me use the time while she's gone and comes back. Just go quickly into the next slide so we don't lose any time today. As I said, this is a series of workshops that WBCSD, GBI, and CEBDS are hosting. Today is the first one, really an introduction to the UN Guiding Principles. Then in 2 weeks' time, we want to talk about how you talk to your colleagues about business and human rights, so really with elements of training and capability building, and how you bring the topic into your company, how you, you inform your colleagues, how you inspire them, and how you help them understand the topic and take it forward in their own functions. Then in June, the 9th of June, the first webinar in June on engaging stakeholders, where we will discuss indigenous communities, FPIC, and grievance mechanisms. So really diving deeper into the topic and looking at some issues that some of you have highlighted to us as really important for them. And then the last meeting on the 23rd of June about managing human rights risks in the supply chain. So really then looking also how companies of your size and of your complexity can look into managing human rights risks in with suppliers, and really looking into the different tiers and how your responsibility to respect human rights plays out at those different levels. I don't see Andrea being back yet, so I'll just continue going. Today, based on the registrations we had, these are the companies that are in the room or should be in the room. We have quite a number of participants, almost 60 have actually logged in, and we have similar numbers in the next weeks, in the next webinar, so we can really look at having some really engaging discussions with a business audience and really making it tangible for you. So while we wait for Andrea to join back, I would ask you to either on a browser or on your phone, go to menti.com, www.menti.com, and then enter the code 753578. And this is what we're going to use today to get to know each other. You will see a screen like this popping up soon. This is the question that that we will ask you, and you have different options of responding, either by typing or by choosing an answer. And then we will have a very fun and interactive visual on the screen. When we change the question, you will see something like this pop up. So you can then go to the next slide on menti.com. It should appear on the top of your phone or your screen, so that you see the new question that we ask. And with that, quickly change to Mentimeter. There we go. So the first question is, which city are you calling from? If you can please write down the city you're calling us from, and then we will see if most people are in Rio or in Geneva or Sao Paulo, in Santa Rita do Oeste, Singapore even. So we have people from really calling from all over the world. And most of them seem to be from Rio. We have Dublin, Milan, Madrid, Montreal, so Canada is here as well. Very nice. This is really also to just warm you up to the tool, really to get to learn, get to know each other, the tool itself and how it works. We have Andrea back. So Andrea, can you speak? Mm-hmm. Nope. Unfortunately, we still can't hear Andrea. She is back, but we can't hear her. I see someone wrote in the chat, Sao Paulo, please write it in the menti.com so that it shows up. Thank you very much. Andrea, it's still not working. In the meantime, let me ask you the next question. The next question is, sorry, many things at once here. The next question we would like to ask you is, what function do you work in your companies? And then choose one of the 9 options or other if we didn't cover your function. So we see a lot of people in sustainability, 9 from human rights, legal, some procurement. Very nice, thank you. We go to the next. I think if everyone has voted, we would go to the next one, or we see a few more from sustainability joining us as well. So we see, maybe we will then see later in the chat, you can also tell us what other means, what is your function, what is the function that you are representing that we have missed here. Let's go to the next one so we don't lose too much time. This is really to see how well do you know the UNGPs, and this is anonymous, so feel free to share with us how much you really know about the UN Guiding Principles. Are you already an expert? Gerald, I hope you pop up there. Do you have very good knowledge, some knowledge, or is the UNGP, are the UNGPs something very new to you? And I see that someone else joined into Gerald's bar. I think Simone, Katie, Ben, I see you. Some of our members maybe who want to also share later what they know about the UNGPs. I see that most have some knowledge, so we hope that today we can improve that knowledge, increase that knowledge, really share with you some valuable insights. Some people are also very new to the UNGP, so definitely today is the right session to be with us. And everyone who already has knowledge will definitely, hopefully, leave the room, leave the webinar with more knowledge than before. I would then, let me go to the to the next question. And here really, we would like to know from you, what do you expect from the workshop today? Just write a few words so that we know why you joined us today, why you are interested in learning more about the UNGPs, or starting to learn what the UNGPs are and what they mean. Best practices, very good. We have a few of those today. So while these come in as practices, so this especially to our experts and to our moderators today, here we see what people are expecting today, examples, challenges, learning, development, and then now we see more and more coming in. So this screen will slide up. And we will make available the, not the full slides, but we will share with you some of the input that we received through Mentimeter will also be made available after the workshop. So you also see what other participants hope to get from these workshops, and how we can make that happen also today, but also in the next webinars. So Katie, Simone, Gerald, I think we have quite a lot of practices to share here. Let's see then how we make this happen. Let's go to, sorry, I just popped one. And the last question we have before we dive into the topic, what are the top 3 human rights priorities for your company? And here we have a few options. Again, you can choose, in this one, you can choose up to 3, or 1 or 2 as you prefer. But what are the topics that are most important for your company when it comes to human rights? Here we have child labor, modern slavery, and forced labor. land rights, health and safety, excessive use of force. We have land rights, working conditions, freedom of association. What are the topics that you see most important for your company? Thank you. We see here again, I hope colleagues that we get some insights. And then we will also see with Gerald and with Simone what their perspective is on these topics in general, but also the relevant topics in the Brazilian context. Andrea, let me see if I can see you here. Can you speak? Andrea? I can't hear Andrea. We seem to have problems with her audio. Let me hand over, or go back to the slides. And see if Andrea can join later via her phone, maybe. Or if we have lost her. Katie, I would hand over to you now and see if we can solve the problem with Andrea in the meantime. Can you hear me, Andrea, Katie?
Yeah, thank you, Davide.
Perfect.
Perhaps I can run through and give some brief introductions at our end, and then before we dive into Gerald's presentation, we can check in with Andrea on whether her audio is working again.
Yeah, exactly. I'll check in the meantime. You please go ahead. I gave you control. You should have the slides now.
Thank you very much. So just to give, I guess first a welcome also from me. We are very pleased to be partnering with WBCSD and CEBDS on this webinar series, although we're sorry we weren't able to do it in person this time for obvious reasons around the COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights, or GBI, we are a business-led organisation that works to advance business respect for human rights around the world. We're a membership-based organisation. We have 20 member companies. They are all leading multinationals that represent different industries, and they're headquartered in different parts of the world. And we work with the human rights teams to support peer learning and sharing of practical approaches amongst our members, but then also amongst business practitioners from other companies as well, both at a corporate level and also at a local and operational level. We've been partnering with organisations like WBCSD, UN Global Compact local networks, and others to convene practical, safe space conversations like this amongst business in different parts of the world over the past 10 years. And over that time, we've also learned a lot about what this work looks like in practice. We're also fortunate to be able to draw on a network of advisors who bring expertise in international and regional developments, and also act as critical friends to us and importantly to our members. And it's wonderful to have both Gerald and Simone with us today. We're also hoping to continue our work, certainly with WBCSD and CEBDS and in Brazil, going forwards, and if we're able to travel again next year, would really look forward to doing something like this in person when we can. As Davide mentioned, our focus today will be on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. For those of you who are newer to working with human rights issues, and I saw a few in the Mentimeter survey we just did, today's webinar is really a chance to learn about international standards and how these are influencing local laws and the expectations of investors, of business partners, and also of civil society organisations. I also know that many of you are familiar with these standards and have been working with them for some time. For you, today is really an opportunity to refresh and deepen your understanding. The UN Guiding Principles are designed to be practical, and they were written with the realities of business in mind. But they also set a challenging standard, and I think it's useful to revisit them from time to time. We want these webinars to be interactive and to really create as much space as possible for you all to be speaking. Today, for this first webinar, we'll be more focused on presentations because we really want to ensure that we're all familiar with the UN Guiding Principles and the expectations they set of business before we then start discussing how to go about implementing them in practice, which we'll get to in the rest of the webinars in this series. But today I do want to encourage you all to feel empowered to ask questions throughout our discussion. Towards the end, there'll be some space to hear from some of you about why you find the UNGPs helpful and how they've been guiding your work on human rights. We also know that not everyone will be completely comfortable speaking in English. So as Enrique said, if you don't understand something, please don't hesitate to use the chat function to ask for clarification. If you'd like to ask a question in Portuguese as well, we'd really encourage you to do that. We don't want language to be a barrier to having a good discussion today. So we have both Gerald Pachoud and Simone Roche Pinto with us today, and they are both GBI advisors. To give you just a brief background on them both, Gerald is the managing director of Pluto and Associates, which is a small consultancy that focuses on corporate responsibility and global public policy. He has spent much of his career working in the Swiss Foreign Ministry and with various UN offices. Most significantly, he acted as an advisor to Professor John Ruggie throughout his mandate as the UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, and he was deeply involved in the development and the writing of the UN Guiding Principles. So today we have really a unique opportunity not just to learn about these standards from Gerald, but to also ask questions about the background discussions and to get insight into why the expectations of business were framed the way they were. Many of you may also know Simone, who is a leading business and human rights advisor in Brazil. Simone has deep expertise on the business and human rights landscape in Brazil and around the world, and also on the expectations and the priorities of a wide range of organizations that are working on these issues in Brazil and in Latin America. She's been in this space for many years now. Currently, she's working as an independent consultant with major companies to address business and human rights related challenges. She also teaches business and human rights as well as international relations at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Previously, she worked with a large Brazilian multinational, supporting the creation of their human rights department and the development of their human rights policies and due diligence processes. She also has a lot of experience working with both human rights and humanitarian organizations. So Simone and Gerald, you are very welcome. Gerald, before we turn to you, I wonder if this is a good moment to just check in and see if Andrea's connection is working.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie. Andrea?
Hello, can you guys hear me now? I joined from my phone.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Wonderful.
Oh, thank goodness. I was so worried.
There we go.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
All right, so I'll be as brief as possible because I know we've taken up a lot of time. So I'll try to do this in an expedited way. But first of all, I really wanted to thank everyone, WBCSD, GBI and CEBDS for organizing this really important discussion, especially in the days we're facing now. And I wanted to thank everyone individually who's putting this, putting the show together, and also to thank Gerald and Simone as speakers, co-speakers here today. And also thank all the participants who have taken the time for this really relevant discussion in a very difficult time, because it really is impossible to separate the discussion of human rights from what we're experiencing today with the pandemic of coronavirus. In a world where we were living in such an individualistic way and society, where we looked at the world and pretty much ignored the collective impact of our actions. It is impressive and also heartwarming to see the wave of people uniting in solidarity and looking at things that perhaps we were all taking for granted or choosing not to delve into as we are now. But we have to look beyond this, because what we already knew, and one of the consequences, and the very sad consequences of the virus when it attacks different regions, is that it really highlights the undeniable inequality that still exists in the world today. Social inequality in Brazil and in the world at large is historical, and we can see, and it's become the center of attention when we look at, as the emergence of COVID spreads, we see how the pandemic impacts even more gravely more vulnerable populations whose access to basic rights is restricted or denied. We also know that a significant part of the economically active population will be financially affected by this pandemic. And yes, health has to be the premier focus of everyone in preserving life at all costs, but we also need to understand how we can deal with all of the workers, formal and informal, who will lose their jobs, and the consequences that are brutally going to impact everyone. The OECD estimates that in Brazil alone, close to 8 million people are going to lose their jobs because of COVID. When we look at the Amazon region right now, it is truly collapsing, not only because we are facing significant limitations of the health system in place, but because some of the bad consequences of forest depredation have been enhanced during the time of COVID. So we must, more than ever, as a community of people who care and who lead in their respective areas and in their respective companies and in their respective NGOs or in civil society or in the government, we have to unite. We have to really unite to reduce the contagion so that, the health infrastructure can be minimally put in place. We have to unite to protect the most vulnerable and really reinforce all of the principles behind the human rights agenda, while we find creative ways to put the economy back, but not the way we were operating the economy before, because I think we all know and we've seen the good consequences of the world stopping for a few months in terms of the environmental benefits that are undeniable now. If anyone had any doubts as to the impact of human activity on the planet in terms of environmental impact, there is no way that anyone can have any doubts anymore. But how do we restore the economy without restoring the bad practices and the incompatible, unsustainable operating processes that we had in the past? So we at Natura and at Natura & Co have been trying to manage one day at a time, looking at the scenarios that are placed in front of us and going back to the principles that have guided us all along, and really trying to ensure that in this process, we also re-engineer even further the business practices that we think needed re-engineering, and using our network to create new agendas of innovation as a way to deal with societal, environmental, and social problems, and find creative solutions that we as business can respond. So with that, I am again extremely happy to be here And again, I apologize for the sound issues we faced in the beginning, but I'm so happy that WBCSD and CEBDS and GBI have put together this discussion, because it's imperative that we proactively engage in actions that foster human development, reduce social injustice and inequality everywhere. And the Human Guide principles, where we look at, preservation of freedom of speech, movement, congregation, that we strive for no discrimination, especially at a time when people in fear may heighten their discrimination practices, of health and safety to everyone, of access to living wage, gender equality, education, and so much more. So I think we all have a role to play, and I really feel that it won't be easy, and it's not necessarily a fact that people will realize that all that we are living can evolve to a better world. I think we will need to push and drive for that agenda and for that to happen. But I believe that if we put our sights and our hearts to it, that we will succeed. We may not see leaps of progress, but we can definitely impact that we step forward and that we take steps in the right direction. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone again, and hope that you have an amazing webinar and an amazing discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Very, very thankful for you joining us. Sorry for the inconvenience. It worked for 2 seconds and then we lost you. Thank you very much. We were very excited to have you with us today. I know that you have another commitment, so thank you for making the time and staying on until actually already 11 a.m. and past 11. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you.
For everyone who wants to see more of Andrea and business human rights, there's a video that we published last year in WBCSD. We will share the link with you after the webinar, so that you can see her inspiring words there as well, and where she calls for action on business and human rights by business leaders. With that, Katie, I would hand back to you, and so that you can take us through the webinar again.
Thank you very much, Davide, and thank you again from me, Andrea. So it wouldn't be a webinar during these times if we didn't have at least one technical hiccup. But Gerald, we might turn to you now. And Davide, are you able to give Gerald control of the slides so he can go at his own pace? But Gerald, it would be great if you could take a few minutes to talk us through in some detail why the UNGPs are important and what business practitioners need to know about them.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. I hope I have control of the thing. Perfect. Thank you for having me. And we saw with the very fancy Menti app that people come from very different backgrounds and level of expertise around the guiding principles. So I will try to hit that soft spot where it is interesting for everyone without getting too boring for those who know more. But the key, as you have mentioned, Katie, is really not to hesitate to ask questions. And we will have, I'm sure, a very rich discussion in the Q&A section. I thought it would be interesting to start by just putting the business and human rights discussion with a little bit of background and context, because business and human rights might seem new, but it's not. The role and the impact of businesses on society is not something that has been discussed since yesterday. And if we just look back over the last 20 years, what we saw at the turn of the century, where the first really big discussions around globalization emerged, we saw a lot of new initiatives like the UN Global Compact. I'm sure you are all familiar with. WBCSD got a new impetus around that time too. We saw multi-stakeholder initiatives and company initiatives developing as well. And we stayed in that frame of not knowing exactly what was what until 2011. And 2011 is really a clinching spot with the adoption of the UN guiding principles. Of course, I'm biased, but when you look at what has happened since, you can see that it's really a change in the whole sustainability discussion, because with the adoption of the guiding principles, we had a clear framework for once on what right is right for a company. What does it mean to be responsible in terms that have been widely accepted? And something that you will always see when we discuss the guiding principles is that they have been universally endorsed by the Human Rights Council. And for those of you who follow a little bit international politics, you will quickly realize that unanimity at the UN is not something that comes often. So the fact that the guiding principles got that unanimous support shows that even though they are not a legally binding instrument, they reflect really the expectations of the international community. And they have had a trigger effect. And what is interesting in this slide is that you can see that since 2011, we have seen an acceleration of instruments around corporate responsibility. The US Dodd-Frank Act, at the EU level, in the UK, in France, everywhere in the world. And it's interesting to see that some might think that the discussion is only, I'm trying to change slide, but of course it doesn't work anymore. Sorry about that. Some might think that it's only focused in Europe and in Asia. But what is interesting is that, and something that we need to always underline, is that when we talk about the UN guiding principles, all the standards are reflected one-to-one in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprise. And Brazil is one of the signatories of the OECD guidelines. So this picture might be a bit misleading, because as a company, you are under the expectation to respect human rights under the UN guiding principles, but also under the OECD guideline for multinational enterprise. So what's the value add of the guiding principle? And here again, what are the value add of the guiding principles? Like I said, they provide a single authoritative standard. They set what is expected from company. And before the guiding principles, you can remember that we had a lot of claims. Oh, business, because they have money, should replace the state. Oh, business is so bad that they should do X, Y, and Z. So now we know exactly what is expected from states and what is expected from companies. But more interestingly, and for those of you who read UN documents, you will see that the guiding principles are written slightly differently, because what we try to do is to offer a roadmap for implementation. And at the end of the day, if you look at the second pillar of the guiding principle, which deal with business responsibilities, it's a business management guide. Don't take it as anything else than a roadmap that will help you implement a risk-based approach to human rights, managing your impact on people. And finally, the last value add of the guiding principle was definitely to allow for alignment. Now we focus on one clear and precise role for companies, but also for scale. And clearly, the development of a lot of initiatives are based on the clarification that the guiding principle brought. So what is the architecture? As I just mentioned, one thing that the guiding principles did was to replace the state into the discussion in corporate responsibility. We had a tendency to say, oh yeah, states are failed, states are bad, states are, and so on and so forth. So business should do everything. And it was extremely important to restate and reframe the discussion on corporate responsibility. States have a duty to protect human rights. That's the law. That's their political commitment. So it's extremely important to always remember that states have a huge role to play. On top of that, or in addition of that, or side by side, the research that we did during the Ruggie mandate clearly identified a responsibility for a company to respect human rights. And here we can see immediately a difference between protect and respect. In a weird way, respect is a negative responsibility to do no harm, not to have negative impact, but it doesn't mean that it's a small responsibility. And finally, the last pillar of the guiding principle is this idea to promote and improve access to remedy. Of course, because remediation is a key concept in human rights, but also because we saw that even though we designed the guiding principles mostly as a prevention tool, trying to avoid negative harm, the reality of life makes it that sometimes, bad things happen. And we wanted to clearly flag what is supposed to be done when you need to provide remedy. And remediation, and I will say that again later on, is a very important element in terms of management, just to avoid repetition. If you don't remedy a small issue, something that might seem as a petty issue, it will escalate. And with that, you escalate the risk to your business. So remediation shouldn't be seen as punishment, but really as a management tool to avoid escalation and repetition and more risk for business and for people. So very briefly and very quickly, this state duty to protect, as I mentioned, it's international law, political commitment that state must protect human rights. So it means that they should take all appropriate steps to investigate, prevent, punish, and redress negative human rights impact. But they also have a role to help and to foster corporate responsibility across business. And it's something that, unfortunately, we don't see enough. In the discussion on the role of state, it's a bit binary. Oh, state should just punish. Or, oh, state should just help. Well, the role should cover the two aspects. And of course, one of the big discussion, and I don't want to get into any detail, is the reach of the home state, because we have seen a lot of discussion in corporate responsibility to see if the home state should impose their obligations when business take place abroad. And clearly, we have seen that that's the case. I'm happy to discuss it in more detail, but that's not really the focus of today. The focus of today is this corporate responsibility to respect. And you will see in the brown box the actual text of the guiding principle. Even though we have tried to make it sound simple, it's a bit UNE. But what does it mean in the end? It means that all companies, regardless of size, should respect human rights whenever and wherever they operate. The mechanism of this respect is to do no harm, to avoid having negative impact, or if you do, to remedy them. And of course, the other mechanism to be able to avoid those negative impacts is to exercise what we have called human rights due diligence. And one thing that is extremely important is that we try to use language that is known in the business community. You all know due diligence, maybe for something else, but all businesses know due diligence extremely well. And of course, the scope, which was also a big discussion, is on all international human rights, because out of research, we saw that businesses can negatively impact any human rights. But we also know that human rights is something that is perceived quite often as political and creating tension and not accepted everywhere. So we went for the most basic standard of all. It's the International Bill of Human Rights and the ILO Fundamental Rights at Work. Why? Because those standards have been accepted everywhere in the world. There is not one country in the world that doesn't recognize the rights set in the bill or the ILO 8 Fundamental Conventions. But of course, we also add in the guiding principles that you should consider other standards when you operate in specific contexts. Indigenous issues is clearly one, but also when you operate in conflict-affected countries, the standards recognized by international humanitarian law. So, like I said, the guiding principles at the end of the day for business are a roadmap with clear milestones. The first is to set a policy commitment. And it might sound trivial or small or weird to say that you should set a policy commitment. But for John Ruggie, who is a professor, it was important, and I think he was onto something very specific when he said something that is well understood is something that is well written. And setting the policy commitment is much more important than just having a policy. It's the process by which you develop the policy commitment that is important. You don't stay alone in your office, in your sustainability department, not talking to anyone. You need to engage with all parts of the company to see if what you are putting down will be respected. So that's much more the process than the product that is important. The second stage of the roadmap, of course, is to exercise due diligence, and we will discuss it a bit in more detail. And the last part is to communicate. And here, it's important to see that the point is to communicate and not only to report. There is a lot of discussion about sustainability reporting and so on and so forth. What was important for us was to flag that a company needs to go out there and to engage with affected stakeholders, which means that you will communicate sometimes through sustainability reports, the way we know it, if you want to address investor concerns, for instance. But if you have an issue with a community, a glossy brochure won't do the trick. So it's important to communicate in the appropriate manner for who you try to engage. It seems fairly obvious, and a lot of things in the guiding principles at the end of the day seem fairly obvious, but needed to be restated. And we saw clearly from our research that sometimes the most obvious things wasn't that obvious. And of course, what the guiding principle did was to move people from the discussion about business and human rights or corporate responsibility overall from name and shame to this great tagline, I love it, to know and show. A company should know what's going on and should be able to demonstrate, to show that it has taken the right step. So one of the questions that comes most often when we discuss business and human rights, and I'm sure you're fully aware of that, is this idea that human rights are complicated. And it's true that when you read the Bill of Rights, it might sound scary, the right to equality before the law, the right to peaceful assembly and association. It seemed really grand and very far from business. But in reality, what we talk about is something that you know fully well. And what you see here, and we don't have time to go into details, but is a translation from those grand words in the Bill of Rights to actual activities. Even if someone doesn't know about human rights, you know about forced labor, you know about passport retention, you know about the level of adequate wage. I'm not saying that you know exactly how much it is, but that's something that you know about. You know about the use of excessive force, and so on and so forth. And so it's important to see human rights as benchmarks that allow you to clearly and objectively assess your impact. And I always give this example when I used to work for the Foreign Affairs for a very long time. I was the lead negotiator at the Human Rights Council. And one time, an NGO came to me, someone from an NGO came to me and said, oh, telecommunication companies should give free phones to everyone in Africa. Oh, why is that? Oh, the right to free speech. Well, that's not really the way it works. And by having a discussion based on human rights standards, we could clearly make a difference between what the guy wished and what was required to respect human rights and to give dignity to people. And I think that it's something that is extremely important to understand and to internalize, is that the guiding principles set minimum expectations. But having this human rights approach, using those human rights standards, also set a ceiling, a maximum on what can be asked of company. You can always go beyond, of course, for different reasons. But the guiding principles set those parameters at the bottom, but also at the top. This is what is expected from companies to be called responsible. And of course, like we just discussed, human rights are present in all areas of your company, one way or the other. The one thing that is always interesting is that a lot of people don't realize that health and safety is a human rights discussion at the end of the day, always. And likewise, human rights are present into a lot of things that what you do. And that's a small trick, but when you are trying to develop human rights policy and processes, look at what exists in your company, because you will see that you can leverage and tweak a lot of existing things and respect human rights better. So, like we said, the cornerstone, and if you need to remember just one thing, that's it. The cornerstone of respect for human rights, of the whole guiding principles for business, is this idea of human rights due diligence. Like I said, we use the term due diligence specifically because it's something that was known into business circles. And when you look at the process behind human rights due diligence, it's a classical due diligence process: identify, integrate, track, and communicate. Of course, the fact that it's about human rights include a couple of small tricks, but the processes is not something new. The first of those is when you identify impact, you shouldn't look at it from the perspective of the company, but from the perspective of the impacted people. And here again, the anecdote is that if your company operations kill a couple of chicken as a risk or as an impact, it's negligible. But of course, for the farmer who has 4 chickens in total and depends on it for his livelihood, the impact will be huge. So it's extremely important to always get the perspective of the impacted people. Second point is to integrate, because we see so many times that the companies actually do a great job at identifying and assessing the risk or the impact, but they don't integrate in their operation. Likewise with tracking. Make sure that what you did is effective. And I already touched on communication, which is the same thing as identifying. Put yourself in the shoes of the people you want to communicate to and tailor the means you use for that specific audience. You don't speak to a local community, an indigenous community, the same way as you talk to a broader audience. 2 quick things to know also about the way to exercise this due diligence. Once you have assessed, you will see a whole lot of risk. And particularly for big business, the environment is huge. And so it's why it was important in the guiding principle to specify that you're not expected to do everything at once. If you can, all the better. But the reality is that you probably won't. So we put criteria down in order for you to prioritize how you address those human rights. And it's, again, not brain surgery. how serious the impact is, how big, widespread the impact is, and how easy will it be to put it right. And of course, you start by those who are the most difficult to remediate, because if someone is dead, there is nothing more to do. You start by looking at those who have the biggest magnitude or are the most great. But one thing that we have seen over the last few years of implementation of the guiding principle is that people use prioritization and tweak it a bit and say, oh, we will only deal with the most serious. No, you deal with all of them, but in a sequence starting with the most serious. And there is a caveat and two interesting specifications for businesses in the guiding principle. The first is this situation where the local context, the local market will have laws, regulation, practices that are below international standards. And in that case, we tried once again to be pragmatic and realistic and to say that business should not disregard local laws because you have to follow the law as a business, but to try to honor the spirit of the higher standards, which means, for instance, if you operate somewhere where there is widespread and systematic gender discrimination, you try in your operations and in the way you interact with society to apply a non-discriminatory approach. And the other thing is, beyond any discussion, when you identify a risk to be involved in very serious gross human rights abuse, treat it like if it was the law. We have seen so often legal department in companies saying, oh, there is no issue there because there is no law. So you end up being linked to genocide. And even though we are on the Chatham House rules, I won't cite any company, but we know of a very big, tech company who has been linked to genocide. Probably the worst thing that you can imagine in human rights terms, but also in reputation terms. Because the legal analysis says, oh yeah, but we are fine. No, when the risk is huge, react as such. And the key question is always, can we operate responsibly in this context? And that's an analysis that each company will need to do, assessing also the consequence of staying somewhere that is very difficult. And we see now more than ever a scrutiny that is put in companies operating in all kinds of contexts. And it might not hurt you today, it might not hurt you tomorrow, but it will come back to hurt you. And particularly to companies who have international investment, we see almost every week investors more and more asking questions about things that didn't happen last week or last year, but 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So really in terms of risk management, yes, I will conclude here.
Thank you. I give you 2 minutes to wrap up.
2 minutes will be more than easy. So what? There is 3 ways you can be linked to a negative impact as a company. The first is when you cause the negative impact or the negative risk. You are a sugarcane company, you have child labor. In that case, the requirement is to not do it or to try to avoid doing it if it hasn't happened, and to remedy. At the end of the day, it's very easy. You break it, you fix it. Doesn't create a lot of question. The second situation is when you don't do anything bad per se, but you contribute because of your ask to the negative impact. Let's imagine that you are the company B, you buy the sugar at such a low price that the producer has to use child labor in order to fulfill its order. You don't do anything wrong directly, but you contribute to a negative impact. In that case, stop doing that contribute to remedy the situation because you are not the only one involved, and try to insist on the company that is doing the bad thing to stop it. And the last thing, and that's one of the most interesting things that has been put forward by the guiding principle, and it came from the realization that the business structure today is not cause and contribute most of the time, but it's very extended value chain, and we see that in COVID, in the COVID crisis, where you are linked to a negative impact, either through your product, your services, or your operations. And let's imagine that you are company A and you produce ethanol. But our guy at the sugarcane level is still using child labor. You didn't do anything wrong. Your contracts and the price you pay are fair, everything. But through your product, you are linked to a negative abuse, an abuse or a negative impact. In that case, you know, the guiding principle clearly states that you don't need to remedy because you are not for anything in the situation, but you are still involved. So you should use your leverage, your influence across your value chain to try to make it stop. But of course, like I said, and I will stop there, the value of the guiding principles and to have a normative framework is that it sets minimum expectations, but also maximum expectations. And clearly, it's not because you are connected to a bad situation, just because that you are responsible for anything. And in that case, and I'll be happy to discuss it in more detail now, let's imagine that you're still doing your ethanol, and a guy is also producing beef, and he does bad thing in his beef business. Even though you are connected to that guy, you have no responsibility. To conclude, Katie, because I see you fidgeting, one picture of 1,000 words. Whatever you think about human rights and the difficulties and all that, the train has left the station. So as business, in terms of simple risk management, you need to develop effective measures. Thank you. Apologies for the overstay.
Thank you, Gerald. Really appreciate that. I didn't want to cut you off earlier because I just think this discussion is incredibly valuable. There's a lot we could unpack around cause, contribution, direct linkage in particular, so perhaps that's worth a dedicated session at some stage to work through some hypotheticals and really get to grips with how you put those concepts into practice. For now, I'd like to turn quickly to Simone, and it would be great, Simone, if you could just share with us quite briefly, because we've been a little bit ambitious with the time today, but if you could share with us a little bit about how the UNGPs have been influencing companies based in Brazil. You know, we've seen from Gerald a lot of the developments that are happening in Europe, in the US, in Australia, and Canada. But we also know that they are shaping expectations of investors, of business partners. In Brazil, they've been embedded in the OECD guidelines and so forth. So if you could just, in a few minutes, talk us through that, and maybe also flag some of the key human rights challenges that the businesses face in Brazil, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Davide, if you could take control of the slides again, but just flick it one further over.
I have control. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. David, I think we can go. Yes, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, Gerard, for this, as usual. So in terms of Brazil, we have to consider the institutional aspects, the political aspects, and the human rights aspects more specifically. I hope that by the end of my short presentation, we will have been able to combine all these three aspects. But I would start by saying that we have expectations from external stakeholders and from internal stakeholders. They coincide to a great extent when it comes to businesses respecting human rights, and moreover, applying or trying to apply the UN guiding principles. So in terms of investors, there's a massive uptake internationally, but moreover and more frequently now in terms also of Brazilian investors. In regards to business and human rights, it takes place in Brazil often through the ESG risk assessments or ESG results of what they expect or what they find in companies. But the thing is that this is not going to change. Brazil is already not so well portrayed in ESG standards by some international investing companies or conglomerates. And it's not been getting any better since last year with the fires in the Amazons and everything that has been calling so much attention upon Brazil in the past few years. In terms of international organizations, OECD has already and therefore will need to abide to standards, including the guidelines and including, therefore, the UN guiding principles. But also the UN, the ILO, and inside the UN, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur systems, the UN Working Group for Business and Human Rights have always been looking to Brazil, but now this also has been getting more acute. Brazil was listed by the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights in the UN Council's meeting, the last one, as one of the 30 countries where human rights violations are at greater risks. ILO has also portrayed Brazil in the past 2 years as one of the countries in the higher risks of human rights violations. And that includes more recently the discussion around the Alcantara Bays and the Quilombola communities. So in terms of international institutions, the scrutiny is not getting any better. To the contrary, it's going to get reinforced. And the UN guiding principles are part of these questioning that companies or the country may get, but they also are and can be part of the solution of how to deal with the situation. Internally, federal government has, through the former Human Rights Ministry, now Family, Women and Human Rights Ministry, has issued a number of directives, mainly from 2018 onwards. There are numerous initiatives, I'm not going to name them. They have commitments, but they have deeply integrated, so to say, the UN guiding principles into the letter, not of the law as yet, but of some sort of policy commitment and of signaling from the federal government, and I repeat, mainly from the government previous to this one, in regards to the UN guiding principles. You are certainly, if you operate in Brazil, you're certainly familiar with the role of the Public Attorney's Office in terms of human rights in general, but in particular in terms of watching the performance of businesses in regards to human rights impacts and violations. And the Public Attorney's Office has been more and more involved also in regional developments in terms of the UN guiding principles. They have organized regional meetings around that. They have issued papers around that. So the Public Attorney's Office, beyond the vast and great normative base that we have in Brazil in terms of human rights, is also now trying to include the UN guiding principles into their discussions with their peers at least. Civil society and academia, if you operate in Brazil, you also know that civil society is very keen to watch on what businesses are doing. This is way previous the UN guiding principles. If you follow the dam situations and MAD, for instance, this dates back at least 1 decade previous to the UN guiding principles. So this is something that civil society has always been doing. it has included the UN Guiding Principles into their roles, the role of norms that they expect companies to follow. And some organizations such as Connectors really have a chapter on business and human rights, and particularly follow what companies are doing in regards to the UN Guiding Principles. Same thing to academia, with think tanks being created and formed in Brazil to follow precisely what companies are doing in regards to human rights. And this is very much linked to the 2011 UN Guiding Principles. Next one, please, David. The context where we are right now, as you certainly have noticed, especially if you live in Brazil, is one of anti-rights rhetoric. And this is even previous to the election. And here we're talking about indigenous rights, tribal rights, quilombolas in particular, LGBT, child work, forced labor, minorities in general, and so forth. And we have some particular challenges that are listed below, but I'm not going to go into each and every one of those. I'm just going to point out some challenges that are cross-cutting to all of them and many others. So we have been seeing the weakening of institutions that are not human rights institutions per se, but autarchies or institutions that are the ones who actually make public policy possible in regards to a lot of different chapters of rights. So here we're talking about INCRA for land rights, we're talking about Fundação Palmares for quilombolas, we're talking about FUNAI, we're talking about IBAMA for environmental rights. So these institutions have been weakened, not to mention all the councils that have been destituted, councils for the children's rights, councils for forced labor, and these two in particular have been reinstated, but many of other councils, democratic participatory councils, have not. Another point is the cutting of budgets. We've seen this throughout all these institutions that I've mentioned and others. The replacement of technical staff by military officers, by police officers, and by religious leaders. And we see this happening in highly technical, or what should be highly technical positions inside IBAMA, inside ICMBio, inside FUNAI, inside even the Human Rights Ministry. Another trend is the denial of science and data, data produced by scientific institutions and by academia. And we can even say that denial of facts altogether. And this has been very clear with the COVID experience recently. And last point about the context is the issuing of legislation or medida provisória for the ones who are Brazilian, coming from the executive, curtailing rights. Many of these have been stopped by either by the first or the second chamber, but also by the Supreme Court. So having said all that and try to wrapping up and make some sense out of this, what you can certainly consider is that inherent risk for human rights violations is increasing in Brazil. So you should take that into consideration, because outside stakeholders certainly are. And risk is part, as Gerald pointed out repeatedly, of the due diligence that the UN Guiding Principles request companies to undertake. Polarization is also increasing from different views of different ways of looking into a given situation. And this is certainly happening in regards to a number of human rights also. And so if you have a higher risk and if you have more polarization, you certainly are dealing with a very high possibility of escalation, something that Gerald also mentioned earlier on. So these are just 3 points that we can easily pick up from the context and the response of the institutions in the country today, to say that if you want to deal with all these, and if you want to deal with much more that's happening, and I won't be able to touch upon them in 10 minutes, you have in the UN Guiding Principles a pretty thorough and to some extent, business-like way of dealing with the situation. And I couldn't advise you more to deep dive into the guiding principles and really see how you could or should use the insights that are more than the insights, that the indications that it provides to dealing with business and human rights in general, but they certainly be very useful to dealing with business and human rights in the current situation in Brazil, and more so considering that's not going to change, and it's likely that it gets worse in the next year or two. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone. That was incredibly helpful. And I think it's flagged a lot of issues and challenges that will no doubt come up in the rest of the webinars in this series as we start to think about talking about these issues with colleagues, engaging with Indigenous communities, and managing issues in supply chains. Okay, I might turn to you for our final couple of minutes just to talk through some resources and some places that people can go if they want more information or more examples of business practice.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Thank you all for the excellent presentations. Mainly, can you pass the slide, David? I think I do not have the control here. Okay, I'll mainly pass the slides because you all received these online resources that you can use later. We have, of course, as the starters, the translation of the guiding principles, and also legal and policy developments around the world, and we can compare to Brazil what we have here. And next one, I like to give your attention to a document we developed together with WBCSD, together with David, and we also had some the translation to Portuguese and cases from Brazilian companies about practices and approaches on our CEO guide for human rights. And also we have their signatures, including Andrea that was here speaking with us earlier. And next one. And also some Brazilian resources that about specific issues regarding Brazil human rights issues. Thank you. I will leave to the final remarks for us not to go further.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Look, a big thank you from all of us to Andrea, who's had to drop off the line, to Simone and to Gerald for sharing their expertise and their knowledge with us today. A big thank you to all of you as well for joining us. As I think we all said at the start of this webinar, we're very excited about the opportunity to do this webinar series with you all and to deepen our conversations over time. We have 3 more webinars coming up, basically every second Tuesday this month and next month. So the next webinar will be the 26th of May, and we'll be talking about training and capability building and how you go about familiarizing your colleagues with human rights concepts and with the company's responsibilities. From the next webinar onwards, we will be putting you all to work and getting you speaking and sharing your own practices, your experiences, what you've been learning, etc. much more. So take that by way of heads up, but it'll be a very interactive next 3 webinars. But from me, I think all I have to do is say thank you and please do let us know if you have any questions or you want to follow up on anything we've discussed so far today. Davide, Enrique, is there anything else that you wanted to say before we close the webinar?
Just very quickly, thank you everyone for joining. We had very good participation. I've received a few questions that we will respond to in the follow-up. 2 questions I think that I received, not too difficult to respond actually in a follow-up email. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to all the speakers, to all the volunteers for sharing their insights. We were planning to have a little feedback, but I think we will just share that in the follow-up as well so that you can tell us what we can improve, what you like, what we should do next time. We will share it with you in the follow-up email so that you can give us your feedback there. With that, I think I have a last slide, and I hope I did it right, to say thank you to everyone, and please stay safe in this time and this very difficult time. So I hope I didn't make any mistake here with my non-Portuguese, but thank you everyone, and hope to see you again in 2 weeks.
Bravo, bravo, Davide.
Thank you, Eduardo.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you on 26.